The flames were visible from 3 blocks away, orange and gold against the pre-dawn sky, twisting upward like angry spirits trying to claw their way to heaven. Marcus Robinson stood in his driveway in bare feet and pajama pants, watching his BMW M5 burn. Not smoke, not smolder. Burn with the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and your skin feel tight even from 15 feet away. The car he'd saved for 7 years to buy. The car he'd driven home from the dealership 9 months ago, with his daughter in the passenger seat, both of them grinning like they'd won the lottery. The car that represented every overtime shift, every sacrifice vacation, every choice to believe that hard work still meant something in America. The fire department would later say the accelerant was gasoline, poured liberally across the hood and interior, ignited with what appeared to be a road flare. But standing there at 5:37 in the morning, Marcus didn't know those details yet. What he knew was the smell of burning leather and melting metal. What he knew was the sound of his neighbors' doors opening, their faces appearing in windows backlit by their hallway lights. What he knew was the sight of Janet Kowalski standing on her lawn 2 houses down, arms crossed, expression unreadable, in the dancing shadows cast by the fire consuming everything he'd worked for. And what Marcus knew, deep in his gut where truth lives before proof catches up, was that this was no random act of vandalism. This was a message. And the war he'd been trying to avoid for 18 months had just gone nuclear. If that opening grabbed you, if you felt that gut punch of injustice, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button right now because this story goes places you won't believe. Places that prove justice sometimes shows up when you least expect it and hits harder than you can imagine. Share this with someone who needs to know that standing your ground matters, that there are consequences for hatred, and that the law can still work even when it feels like the system is rigged against you. And subscribe to Acts of Depth because we tell the stories that matter, the ones about real people facing impossible situations in the moment when everything changes. Now let me take you back to where this all started because you need to understand what led to that fire, what was really burning that morning, and how a HOA Karen's hatred ended up costing her family $7 million and their freedom. Marcus Robinson had moved to Pinewood Heights 18 months before the fire. The subdivision was one of those planned communities that sprouted up on the outskirts of Charlotte in the early 2000s, all brick facades and architectural shingles, homeowners association rules and neighborhood watch signs. He'd bought the house in February, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a backyard big enough for his daughter Kayla to practice soccer. It was a stretch financially, pushing the upper limit of what his salary as a senior aerospace engineer could support. But Marcus believed in the investment. Good schools, safe streets, the kind of neighborhood where kids still rode bikes and people knew their neighbors' names. He'd grown up in a different kind of neighborhood, the kind where opportunity was something you saw on television. And he'd promised himself his daughter would have better. So when the mortgage broker said he was approved, Marcus signed the papers and moved his family into a house on Maple Grove Lane, 3 doors down from Janet Kowalski, who'd been president of the Pinewood Heights HOA for 6 consecutive years. The trouble started small. It always does. 3 weeks after moving in, Marcus received a violation notice in his mailbox. His garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, which violated HOA Code Section 4.7, subsection C. The fine was $50. Marcus paid it and moved the cans to the garage, thinking it was just standard HOA vigilance, the kind of petty rule enforcement that came with living in a managed community. 2 weeks later, another notice. His lawn had exceeded the maximum allowable grass height of 3.5 inches. Another $50 fine. Marcus had just mowed 4 days earlier, but he paid the fine and adjusted his mowing schedule. Then came a notice about his mailbox needing repainting, his house numbers being the wrong font, his garden hose being visible from the sidewalk, his daughter's basketball hoop being 6 inches over the acceptable backboard height. In the first 4 months, Marcus received 17 violation notices and paid $850 in fines. His neighbors, white families who'd lived there for years, received an average of 2 violations per year. Marcus started keeping records. He met Janet Kowalski officially at the June HOA meeting. She was a woman in her late 50s with the kind of blonde highlights that required monthly maintenance and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She ran the meetings with ruthless efficiency, moving through agenda items like a prosecutor presenting evidence. When Marcus stood during the open forum and asked why his property seemed to be receiving disproportionate scrutiny compared to other homes in the neighborhood, Janet's smile didn't waver. She said the HOA board took compliance seriously across all properties and that any perception of targeting was purely coincidental. She said if Marcus felt the rules were too strict, perhaps he should consider whether Pinewood Heights was the right fit for his family. The emphasis on his family was slight but unmistakable. Marcus felt the room's temperature shift, saw the way some neighbors looked away, while others nodded in agreement with Janet. He sat back down and decided to be more careful, to document everything, to follow every rule so precisely that there would be no room for complaints. But careful wasn't enough when the person making the rules had already decided you didn't belong. Marcus had learned about institutional racism in college, had studied the history of redlining and restrictive covenants, had understood intellectually how systems could be weaponized to exclude. But understanding something academically and experiencing it in your daily life are different animals. This was death by 1,000 cuts. The neighbor who called the police because Marcus was suspiciously checking his own mailbox at 9 p.m. The pool committee that suddenly required background checks for all residents after Kayla invited her friends to swim. The parking restrictions that appeared on his street the week after Marcus bought the BMW, limiting overnight street parking to residents who'd lived there more than 2 years. Each incident was small enough to be explained away, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Marcus's wife, Nicole, started having anxiety attacks about coming home. Kayla asked why Mrs. Kowalski always stared at them when they left for school. And Marcus found himself doing calculations he'd never imagined making, weighing the financial loss of selling against the psychological cost of staying. The BMW became a focal point. Marcus had bought it to celebrate a promotion, a reward for 15 years of grinding his way up through a company that had never promoted a black engineer to his level before. It was alpine white with a black leather interior, 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds, a machine that made him feel like all the sacrifice had been worth it. He kept it immaculate, washing it every Sunday morning in his driveway, and he'd be lying if he said he didn't enjoy the way it looked parked in front of his house. But Janet Kowalski saw something else. She saw a black man in her neighborhood driving a car that cost more than some of her neighbors made in a year. She saw a challenge to the natural order she'd spent 6 years maintaining. 2 weeks after Marcus drove it home, Janet filed a complaint with the HOA claiming the car's color violated the neighborhood aesthetic standards. When that went nowhere because no such standard existed, she tried to pass a new rule limiting the value of vehicles that could be parked in driveways overnight. The motion failed, but the message was clear. Your success offends me. Your presence here is a problem I intend to solve. Things escalated after Marcus filed a formal discrimination complaint with the HOA's parent management company in March. He'd compiled 18 months of violation notices, compared them to records from surrounding properties, and built an irrefutable case that his home was being singled out. The management company launched an investigation and quietly told Janet she needed to step back from any enforcement actions regarding Marcus's property. For 2 months, the violation notices stopped. Marcus started to believe that maybe the system worked, that standing up for yourself mattered, that documentation and proper channels could actually create change. Then he came home from work on a Tuesday in May to find his lawn spray-painted with a slur. 6 letters in neon orange across the grass he'd been so careful to keep at exactly 3.5 inches. Nicole called the police while Marcus stood in the yard with his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the rage that comes when you realize that no amount of compliance, no degree of respectability, no level of achievement will ever be enough for people who've decided what you are based on what you look like. The police report went nowhere. No witnesses, no cameras, no evidence beyond the spray paint itself, which could have been anyone. Marcus bought security cameras the next day and installed them on every corner of his house. He documented the vandalism, filed a report with the management company, and increased his homeowner's insurance. He also started paying attention to Janet Kowalski's son. Derek Kowalski was 24 years old and still living in his mother's basement. He dropped out of community college after one semester and worked sporadically at various retail jobs, none of which seemed to last more than a few months. Marcus had seen him around the neighborhood, usually in the late afternoons, driving his mother's silver Honda Accord or sitting on the front porch smoking cigarettes. There was something about the way Derek looked at Marcus's house, a fixation that felt personal. Marcus mentioned it to Nicole, who said he was being paranoid. But paranoia is just pattern recognition that hasn't been proven yet, and Marcus's cameras were about to provide all the proof he needed. The cameras caught Derek walking past Marcus's house 11 times in the 2 weeks following the lawn vandalism. Not walking a dog or jogging, just walking past, slowing down, looking. On June 7th at 2:17 a.m., the cameras caught Derek standing at the end of Marcus's driveway for 4 minutes. Just standing there in the dark, staring at the BMW. Marcus saved the footage and called a lawyer. The lawyer said surveillance footage of someone on a public sidewalk wasn't enough for a restraining order, but that Marcus should absolutely keep documenting. The lawyer also said something that stuck with Marcus. People like this escalate. They don't stop because you ask nicely. They stop when consequences become real. Marcus thought about consequences, about what real accountability looked like, about whether the justice system would actually protect his family or if they were on their own. He thought about selling the house and moving somewhere else, starting over in a different neighborhood where maybe they'd be welcome. But something in him refused. This was his house, his community, his daughter's school district. He'd earned this, and he wasn't going to let hatred drive him out. So he stayed, and he waited for the escalation he knew was coming. It came at 5:23 a.m. on July 15th. Marcus's security cameras captured everything. Derek Kowalski approaching from the street, carrying a red gas canister. Derek circling the BMW, splashing gasoline across the hood and through the open window that Marcus had left cracked because the interior still had that new car smell he loved. Derek pulling what appeared to be a road flare from his jacket pocket. The bright ignition, the whoosh of flame. Derek standing there for 11 seconds, watching it burn before walking away, not running, just walking casually back down the street toward his mother's house. The whole event took 90 seconds from start to finish and was captured in perfect high-definition color from 3 different camera angles. Marcus's phone started screaming alerts at 5:24. He ran downstairs and saw the flames through his living room window. By the time he made it outside, the BMW was fully engulfed, the heat so intense it was starting to melt the siding on his garage. Fire trucks arrived at 5:31, police at 5:34, and by 6 a.m., half the neighborhood was standing in their yards watching Marcus's investment burn down to a charred metal skeleton. The fire marshal examined the scene for 3 hours. The police took statements from everyone on the street, and when Marcus told them he had security footage of the whole thing, you could see the shift in their demeanor, the way they went from treating this as random vandalism to treating it as a crime with an actual suspect and actual evidence. Marcus uploaded the footage to his laptop and played it for the investigating detective, a woman named Sarah Chen, who watched the video 4 times without saying a word. When it finished, she looked at Marcus and asked if he knew the person in the video. Marcus told her everything. The 18 months of harassment, the HOA violations, Janet Kowalski, her son Derek, the lawn vandalism, the late-night surveillance, all of it. Detective Chen took notes and said she'd be in touch. Then she went 3 houses down and knocked on Janet Kowalski's door at 7:45 a.m. while Marcus watched from his front yard and allowed himself to hope that maybe this time, finally, there would be consequences. Derek Kowalski was arrested at 8:37 a.m. in his mother's basement, still wearing the same clothes from the video, reeking of gasoline. The police found the road flare package in his car and the gas can in the garage. Janet tried to call a lawyer, but Derek talked before anyone could stop him, admitting to the arson in a recorded interview and saying he did it because his mother was upset about that guy in his fancy car ruining the neighborhood. The local charges came first-degree arson, hate crime enhancement, destruction of property. Bond was set at $250,000. Janet paid it using her house as collateral, and Derek was released pending trial. Marcus thought that was the end of it, or at least the beginning of the end. A trial, a conviction, maybe a few years in prison, restitution for the car. Justice of the ordinary kind, the type you see on local news and forget about a week later. He had no idea that the federal government had been watching Pinewood Heights for 9 months as part of a larger investigation into housing discrimination. He had no idea that his complaint to the HOA management company had triggered a Fair Housing Act review. And he had no idea that Derek Kowalski's confession had just handed federal prosecutors everything they needed to make an example that would reverberate far beyond one burned BMW. The FBI showed up on September 3rd, not to Marcus's house, to Janet Kowalski's. 6 agents with a warrant to search the premises and seize all HOA records, email correspondence, and financial documents. They were there for 7 hours, leaving with 14 boxes of evidence and a very clear message that this case had just become something much bigger than local vandalism. The federal indictment came 3 weeks later. Derek Kowalski was charged with violating federal arson statutes, destruction of property exceeding $50,000, and conspiracy to interfere with fair housing rights. Janet Kowalski was charged as a co-conspirator under the theory that she had created the hostile environment and directed her son's actions through 18 months of documented harassment. The indictment included every violation notice, every email Janet had sent to the HOA board discussing maintaining neighborhood standards, and several text messages between Janet and Derek that made it clear the arson wasn't a spontaneous act, but the culmination of a campaign. The potential penalties were staggering: 30 years in federal prison, $7 million in fines and restitution, and set forfeiture including Janet's house. These weren't local charges that might get plea bargained down to probation. These were federal prosecutors with unlimited resources and a point to make about civil rights in 2024. The trial took place the following spring in federal court. Marcus sat in the gallery every day for 3 weeks, watching prosecutors dismantle Janet and Derek's defense piece by piece. They showed the security footage of the arson so many times Marcus could have narrated it from memory. They brought in experts on housing discrimination who walked the jury through how HOA rules could be weaponized. They presented the violation notices in chronological order, a growing mountain of paper that painted a picture of a systematic targeting. They read Janet's emails aloud, messages where she complained about those people moving in and changing the character of Pinewood Heights. They showed the text messages between mother and son, including one from the night before the arson, where Janet wrote, "Something needs to be done about that car." And Derek responded, "I got you, Mom." The defense tried to argue that Derek acted alone, that Janet never explicitly ordered the arson, that her HOA enforcement was legitimate neighborhood management. But the jury saw through it. They saw a mother who'd spent 18 months trying to force a black family out of her neighborhood and a son who'd internalized her hatred enough to commit a federal crime. The verdict came back on a Thursday afternoon. Guilty on all counts for Derek. Guilty on conspiracy and civil rights violations for Janet. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks out, but the courtroom reaction was immediate. Janet collapsed in her chair, mopping in a way that might have generated sympathy if not for the 18 months of documented cruelty that preceded it. Derek sat motionless, staring at his hands, perhaps finally understanding that his mother's approval had cost him the next 3 decades of his life. And Marcus felt something he hadn't expected. Not joy, not satisfaction, just exhaustion mixed with a strange kind of grief for what this whole situation revealed about the world his daughter was growing up in. That this level of hatred still existed. That it had to escalate to arson and federal charges before anyone took it seriously. That justice, when it finally came, felt less like victory and more like a confirmation that everything he'd suspected about the invisible barriers black families face was true. Sentencing happened on a bright morning in May, exactly 1 year after the lawn vandalism. The judge was a black woman in her 60s named Adrienne Hamilton, appointed to the federal bench 3 years earlier. She'd reviewed every piece of evidence, read all the victim impact statements, and listened to both defendants' national news. Derek Kowalski received 18 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before 15. Janet Kowalski received 8 years. Together, they were ordered to pay $7 million in restitution, a figure that included the value of the BMW damages to Marcus's property, compensation for emotional distress, and punitive damages designed to send a message. The judge's statement from the bench was 20 minutes long, but the part that stuck with Marcus was this. This case represents the insidious nature of modern racism. Not burning crosses and white hoods, but HOA violations and property standards weaponized to exclude. Not explicit slurs, but neighborhood character and property values used as code for who belongs and who doesn't. The defendants created a hostile environment designed to force a family from their home for no reason other than the color of their skin, and when legal harassment failed, they resorted to criminal destruction. This court will not tolerate such conduct, and this sentence reflects society's commitment to equal housing rights regardless of race. Marcus sold the house 4 months later, not because he was forced out, but because every time he pulled into the driveway, he saw the ghost of flames. Kayla had nightmares about fires. Nicole couldn't sleep knowing Derek's friends still lived in the neighborhood, people who'd posted on social media that Marcus had destroyed a good family over a car. The insurance payout and the settlement allowed them to buy a larger house in a different part of Charlotte, one without an HOA where the neighbors introduced themselves with casseroles and welcomed Kayla to their book club. Marcus bought another BMW, same model, same color, a deliberate choice to not let fear dictate his decisions. But he also installed security cameras, because optimism is fine but documentation is better. And he kept every article about the Kowalski trial, filing them away in a folder he planned to show Kayla when she was older, evidence that standing your ground matters, that justice can prevail, that the arc of the moral universe bends, but sometimes it needs help bending. The $7 million judgment destroyed the Kowalskis financially. Janet's house was seized and auctioned. Her retirement accounts were drained. She declared bankruptcy, but you can't discharge criminal restitution in bankruptcy court. The judgment will follow her for the rest of her life, garnishing any wages she earns, claiming any assets she acquires. Derek will be 62 when he's released from federal prison, assuming he survives 15 years in a system that doesn't treat hate crimes kindly. The Pinewood Heights HOA was dissolved 6 months after the trial when every board member resigned and the management company severed their contract, unwilling to be associated with the liability. Property values in the neighborhood dropped 12%. Janet's friends, the ones who'd nodded along during HOA meetings when she complained about neighborhood standards, suddenly couldn't remember ever supporting her positions. That's the thing about racism that hides behind bureaucracy and rules. It thrives when everyone pretends not to see it, but the moment it becomes visible and costly, all the enablers vanish like smoke. 2 years after the fire, Marcus received a letter in the mail. It was from Derek Kowalski, sent from federal prison, 5 pages of handwriting that alternated between apology and self-justification. Derek wrote that he'd been in therapy, that he understood what he'd done was wrong, that he'd been raised to see the world a certain way but was trying to change. He wrote that he knew no apology could undo the harm, but he wanted Marcus to know he was sorry. The letter ended with a request for forgiveness. Marcus read it twice, then filed it in the same folder with the trial articles. He didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't something Derek was entitled to, just because he'd finally experienced consequences. Maybe in another 10 years, after Derek had actually done the work of changing and not just written about it. Maybe then, but not now. Now Marcus's energy was focused on his daughter, on making sure she grew up knowing her worth wasn't determined by other people's hatred, that her father had stood his ground and won, that justice was possible even when the system made you fight for every inch of it. The story went viral in various forms. Social media posts about HOA Karen getting $7 million in federal charges, news articles about modern housing discrimination, legal blogs analyzing the precedent for using federal conspiracy charges in HOA harassment cases. Marcus was interviewed by several outlets, and each time he told the same story with the same message. Document everything, stand your ground, and understand that individual acts of racism are usually part of a larger pattern. He spoke at a fair housing conference and met other families who'd experienced similar campaigns of harassment, people who'd been forced out of neighborhoods through 1,000 tiny violations, or who'd stayed and fought and won their own smaller victories. He learned that Pinewood Heights wasn't unique, that HOAs across America had been used as tools of exclusion since their inception, and that the fight for equal housing was far from over. But he also learned that progress happened in moments like these, when someone refused to be driven out, when the documentation was thorough enough to make the pattern undeniable, when prosecutors decided to make an example that would deter the next Janet Kowalski from trying the same tactics. On the third anniversary of the fire, Marcus drove past the old house. New owners had moved in, a young Asian couple with twins. The lawn was a different shade of green. The mailbox had been replaced. His daughter's basketball hoop was gone. But the house was still standing, still solid, still part of a neighborhood that had been forced to confront what it allowed to happen in its name. Marcus didn't stop. He just drove past on his way to somewhere else, carrying the story with him like a scar that had healed but never quite faded. He thought about the BMW that burned, about the version of himself that had stood in that driveway wondering if fighting was worth it. He thought about Janet Kowalski in prison, about Derek learning too late that hatred has a price. And he thought about justice, not the quick dramatic kind from movies, but the slow grinding kind that requires documentation and lawyers and juries and judges willing to see what's in front of them. The kind that costs everything to pursue but costs more to abandon. The kind that doesn't fix the past but might, just might, make the future a little more bearable for the next family that moves into a neighborhood where someone has decided they don't belong. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, you know something important now. You know that modern racism doesn't always wear a hood. Sometimes it wears a pantsuit and carries a clipboard full of HOA violations. Sometimes it hides behind rules and standards and neighborhood character. And sometimes it escalates to violence when the bureaucratic harassment doesn't work. But you also know that justice, when backed by documentation and federal law, and prosecutors willing to use the tools available, can hit with the force of $7 million and decades in prison. Marcus Robinson's story isn't just about one burned car. It's about every family that's been made to feel unwelcome in their own home, every person who's been targeted by systems designed to exclude, and every moment when someone chooses to fight instead of flee. Share this story with someone who needs to know that standing your ground matters. Subscribe to Acts of Depth because we'll keep telling these stories, the ones about ordinary people facing extraordinary injustice and the moment when the system finally works the way it's supposed to. And remember that change doesn't happen because we hope for it. It happens because people like Marcus document everything, refuse to be silent, and force the world to see what it would rather ignore. The Kowalskis thought they could burn away what they didn't want to see. Instead, they burned down their own lives and proved that even in 2024, civil rights still matter and federal prosecutors still have teeth. That's not the ending Janet Kowalski wanted, but it's the one she earned. And it's the one that might make the next HOA Karen think twice before she decides someone doesn't belong in her neighborhood based on the color of their skin and the car in their driveway.